any bills that came in that he felt added taxes or fees, he put his veto pen to. And that created an overall record number of vetoes career-wise for the governor.
Hi there, it's WAMC News Director Ian Pickus. And on this episode of the WAMC News Podcast, we recap the Vermont State Legislature's veto session and what it all means. The Vermont State Legislature has completed its veto session, overriding several of Governor Phil Scott's vetoes, including on the new state budget. It caps legislative action this year as the popular Republican governor confronted a statehouse with Democratic-led supermajorities. WAMC's North Country Bureau Chief Pat Bradley has been following all the twists and turns in Montpelier and joins me now. Hi, Pat.
Hi, Ian. How are you?
Great. Well, let's talk about the budget. As I mentioned, that was one of the big sticking points this year in the Vermont State House. So what happened?
Well, the governor had proposed a budget bill that he then said the legislature added on to. And he was not happy about that because he has been opposed to any increase in taxes and fees. So any bills that came in that he felt added taxes or fees, he put his veto pen to. And that created an overall record number of vetoes career-wise for the governor. There were 8 overall vetoes over the course of the session. One was obviously the budget, and there were several others, including a child care bill, which the governor was adamant he was not vetoing the child care provisions, but rather a tax that would be implemented to go along with that child care bill. And other bills that he vetoed included an act that the legislature passed that would have increased their own benefits and compensation.
Now, as I mentioned, there are Democratic-led supermajorities in the State House and State Senate. So, practically speaking, what did the vetoes by Governor Scott, a Republican, accomplish?
I think he, in many cases, knew that they would be overridden, but he was making his point of affordability and not raising taxes and fees at a time when Vermont is having trouble with people coming into the state and finding we can't afford it, we need to move out, even though we may have just moved in. Also, the fact that there is a serious housing crunch, not only in Burlington. Burlington, Vermont has a housing vacancy rate of less than 1%, but the entire state has a housing affordability issue and a housing accessibility issue. And so the governor is saying, if you keep adding taxes and fees, we can't really create an affordable state for people to come to when we also have workforce issues and we have a need for people to come in and have a more youthful workforce. Things like that, I think he's trying to make a point about.
You've been talking to lawmakers and also tracked the veto session. For their part, what did they say about the budget and other bills?
The legislature wants to be able to create some innovative programs and be able to offer the services that the people need. And that's where I think the legislature and the governor clash. He's often said that we have the same goals. It's just that the legislature is trying to move too fast. And so things like the child care. The legislature is trying to implement child care programs and create funding sources to be able to pay child care providers and be able to get more access to child care. But they're putting it all in this one bill, whereas the governor is saying, we need to spread this out a little bit more. The other thing that is occurring is that The governor is saying, we have all these surpluses, we shouldn't use them for one-time funding, and he feels the legislature is using it to really fund one-time programs too much. Some of the things that the legislature has funded includes, things like extending COVID health care regulatory items, technical corrections to the 2023 legislative session. May not cost much, but there's still some funding that is included in that. One of the other things that they all did seem to agree with was they prohibited paramilitary training camps. There was an issue there with actually got some national attention with a guy who had opened up a paramilitary training camp, and the local residents were very upset about that, and that ended up in the state legislature. So, that got into, a little bit of a funding situation, who's going to pay for the oversight of that sort of thing. So, a lot of things went through. Not a lot of debate on some of these things, but there is a cost to a lot of these things, and the governor wants to keep the cost to a minimum and feels that the legislature isn't trying to hold costs down as much as they should.
Do you think it's fair to say that the legislature ultimately got its way on a lot of these issues, given the fact that it could override Scott's wishes?
Not necessarily. There were a couple of bills that during the veto session ended up, rather than getting a vote to override, got sent back to committee. One of them was the bill that they had passed to raise their own wages and benefits. The legislature there was saying, we need to raise our own wages and benefits because then you would see more people running for office. You're not seeing the younger people getting in because they can't afford to run for office in what is a part-time legislature. And so we need to raise our benefits. The governor was saying, well, I won't sign it unless you make the legislative session a set 90-day period. And the legislature wasn't willing to do that. When it came down to the veto session, they ended up sending it back to the Committee on Government Operations, which basically killed the bill for this session. The other one that was killed was S6, which is called an act relating to law enforcement interrogation policies. What that bill wanted to do was bar law enforcement from going to interrogation sessions with youth under age 22 and lying to them in order to get confessions. And I think one of the key things that they ran into speed bumps on, shall we say, was the budget and this whole idea of the hotel-motel voucher system.
Let's talk about that a bit more. This is an issue that we've covered closely, and you've done a lot of stories on in terms of how it pertains to Burlington, Vermont. Let's break that down a little bit.
Yeah, the hotel-motel voucher system was a program that was initially set up by the federal government. What was happening was at the beginning of the COVID-19 pandemic, they wanted to get people, homeless people in particular, who were ending up in communal settings, to get them out of that, because that was a way that COVID-19 could easily spread. So they created this hotel-motel voucher program where families or individuals that were homeless could go into a hotel room and therefore be separated, and COVID couldn't spread as well. So the federal government, after a year and a half, 2 years of this, ended the program. But in Vermont, they felt that the program needed to continue. So Vermont continued funding the program, and it ended up they were spending millions of dollars on this. They never did a competitive bidding program with the hotels. So basically, the hotels could charge what they wanted for the rooms. And it became so expensive that by the beginning of this year, the governor was hinting, we need to close this program down. We need to end it. And by the time his budget was moving forward in the legislature, the program was phasing out. And it was announced that by June and July, all of those still in the program would be evicted basically from the motel rooms, and the administration was supposed to be working with these individuals to find them temporary housing or some sort of transitional housing to get them out of the motel program. Some people in the legislature and a lot of advocates outside of the legislature felt that the program needed to be continued because several thousand people, they claimed, would end up not having any housing at all. And when the legislature passed the budget initially to send it to the governor, there ended up being a number of progressive and Democratic lawmakers who then said, we will sustain a veto of the budget if we don't come up with some sort of solution to the hotel-motel voucher program ending. And so there was this scramble then between the adjournment of the legislature in mid-May and the end of June 20th, when the veto session started, to figure out what to do so that the supermajority of Democrats and progressives in the legislature would be able to override the governor's budget veto, because the governor had vetoed the budget, saying you're spending too much, you're adding fees that you don't need to add. I mean, there's a slew of DMV fees, the child care fees that are property tax fees that were being imposed to pay for child care. So they got, the leadership in the House and Senate got very concerned that the budget veto might be sustained if they couldn't figure out what to do about this hotel-motel voucher system ending. So in the intervening weeks between adjournment and the June 20th veto session, the leadership, the legislative leadership, and the Scott administration worked to craft a bill, a companion bill, that was voted on during the veto session that extends the hotel-motel voucher system for some individuals, the most vulnerable individuals, into next year while they find housing for them. Also, during that period of time, there had been a request by the state to some of the municipalities and towns to come up with plans for how they were going to deal with the homeless individuals that were coming out of that program and probably end up in their communities. And Burlington was expecting to see the bulk of those individuals and had submitted a plan. And Burlington Mayor Merle Weinberger, after the veto session, said that the companion bill very much looked like the proposal that they had submitted. So with this compromise bill, the budget veto was overridden and the bill was passed to deal with this hotel-motel voucher system.
So, Pat, what happens now in Montpelier as we speak here after the June veto session?
Well, pretty much it is adjourned until January, or until they have to come back to deal with another issue, which is the impeachment investigation, which is ongoing. They're looking into Franklin County Sheriff John Grismore and Franklin County State's Attorney John Lavoie. Both of them separate impeachment inquiries, but both going on at the same time. And this is a very rare occurrence in Vermont. Now, what has happened is Sheriff Grismore is being investigated because there's apparently video evidence that shows him kicking a man in the jail. Apparently, he was shackled in the groin. And he has refused to step down or cooperate in any investigations into that. Now, the Franklin County State's Attorney, John Lavoie, has been accused of harassment and discrimination against his employees. And the Vermont Department of State's Attorneys and Sheriffs had been very concerned about that and really pushed for the state to do something about it and wanted the state to push for an impeachment of this state's attorney. And they did eventually move to do that. It seemed like House leadership was rather reticent to do that because it is extremely rare. But that impeachment investigation has begun. There's been some criticism of it by some media outlets because the House leadership has promised transparency, but in most of the meetings that they've held so far, they've gone into executive session, and therefore it's not known yet what kind of evidence they've collected or what's going on with the impeachment investigation.
Well, a lot to keep an eye on coming up in Vermont politics. We've been speaking with North Country Bureau Chief Pat Bradley. Pat, thank you as always. Great job.
Oh, thank you, Ian. You're a great boss.
Okay, that does it for this episode of the WAMC News Podcast. Thanks so much for listening. Until next time, I'm Ian Pickus.